you. Very stylish gentlemen. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you, Charles. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. I'm excited to be speaking with you guys. I'm going to get right into sort of a little bit of your backstory. I'd love to hear that just for the General and Chris. What brought you to the service? A little bit of that character development. Chris, what inspired you to join the service?
Sure. I grew up in a family where my grandfather, my father, uncles, my brother had all served from all the way back from World War II, Vietnam, and then in this current age. And so it was always part of our family culture. And so when I graduated college in the late 90s, I joined the Navy to go into the SEAL teams. But it was a very different time. That was a peace environment, right? And so today's environment obviously is much different, but I was able to stay in the service from the late 90s until 2012, so saw that transition, and that's where I first met and worked for General McChrystal.
Yeah. You envisioned yourself as a SEAL team member from the get-go.
That's why I joined. I wanted to be part of that community. But from the outside, you don't really know what the service is about until you're inside. So I was attracted to the challenge of the SEAL teams, and then once I got inside the community, realized how deep and important the mission was of not just our community, but the service in general.
Yeah. In general, obviously, people are aware of your accomplishments these days. Tell us a little bit about what inspired you to join.
Well, a bit like Chris, my father was a soldier, and my father's father, and I have 4 brothers who are all soldiers, and my sister married a soldier. And at the appropriate time, I married my wife, who is a daughter of a soldier. Her 3 brothers are soldiers. Her sister, yeah, you get it, right? I actually wanted to work at AOL, but I just thought I just couldn't get away with it. It just felt right, and it turned out to be something that I loved.
Could you guys speak about the first experience you had meeting each other? Chris, starting with you.
Sure. I first met General McChrystal. He was a recently promoted 3-star general, I believe. He was running the Global Counterterrorism Task Force. I was a junior officer at an outstation in one of the theaters of conflict, and Stan was a soldier, so he was constantly out in the field meeting with troops. I was very new to that part of the community, and one dark night in the mountains of Afghanistan, he sat with us in our outstation and sort of gave his optic on the fight, on the war, and all of us were immediately impressed by his desire to really understand what was happening on the ground. And I didn't know at the time, but that was a foreshadowing of the change that he was going to implement and how he ran the organization.
Well, it was interesting because I went out and I'm talking to him like I do groups, and you get typical questions. What are we doing here? Why are we doing this? And then I get a young officer asking me, how do all the pieces fit together? So how's this organization really work? How do you run this thing? And I'm thinking, one, none of your business. But it's a really curious question, and that began my belief that Chris had a different focus than many people.
Yeah. Charlie, how about your first impression of these guys and how you got brought into this whole thing?
Sure. Well, I lack the machismo of these guys. Let's see, I first was introduced to kind of General McChrystal and Chris. It was back at Yale University when I was a student of theirs. And I just really did what students do in General McChrystal's leadership seminar. And I was really struck by the subject matter. I enjoyed myself. I talked a lot, as Yale students are wont to do. And I ended up being surprised later in the summer when Chris and I had a conversation about following up General McChrystal's last book, Team of Teams, with a more practical follow-up on how you create that kind of organizational model. And kind of throughout my senior year and since graduation, this has been the life. So it was a pretty fortuitous set of circumstances.
We've learned now in writing our second book, you do 2 things. You come up with an idea, and you get a publisher that will agree to it, and then you find a smart kid from Yale, and you get them on the team, and it's worked out well.
Yeah. Charlie, what was, you obviously have your first impression. You can do whatever research you want to do on these guys. What was the thing that sort of pulled back the curtain? Was there a couple moments that were surprising to you about their characters?
Yeah, what I realized it was very difficult to get a rise out of Chris. He's a very mellow kind of guy, and when you're working with somebody who has such a tight control of their emotions and who's so flexible, much like the organization he was a part of, it was a very good process. In terms of figuring out how to go about the project, I didn't have their direct experience, so my role was much more academic and, in a way, trying to take current intelligence about the state of the world in different sectors of the economy and politics, and applying it to their experiences in Iraq over a decade ago, which was a pretty interesting process.
Yeah. Chris, I mean, you make reference to this in the book, but you were there as this evolution of how the military operated over there in the Middle East. Can you explain what that evolution was like for you and how you decided that would make an interesting book?
Sure, yeah. What it felt like was in the early stages of the post 9/11 years, I was at the tactical level. So I was in a SEAL platoon. We were deploying to different parts of the fight, and pretty soon started to realize that there's a different sort of conflict taking place than what we thought would happen. And now in hindsight, what was happening was we were facing networked threats. So not a traditional system, but a series of actors that were just connected. And so what we found was no matter how hard we pushed, we couldn't get ahead of the problem, which is very similar to what we now see in industry. The solution that we evolved to very organically under the leadership of General McChrystal and others at that level was one that connected very senior leaders all the way down to those of us that were closest to the problems, shared information on a regular and constant basis in a very transparent manner, and then they could decentralize down to our level and allow us to move from problem A to problem B to problem C without checking in and asking permission every time. And that's what we have, since we left the service, believe that's the problem that so many parts of industry are facing. We have fast-moving, interconnected problems on the ground, folks that are close to them that are really talented, but the playbook they have to check in with doesn't give them the autonomy to move quickly enough. And so what we tried to lay out in one mission was the roadmap that we followed to get to the ultimate solution.
Yeah. General, can you speak on that time period and what it was like to enact these changes?
Absolutely. I'd grown up in this task force, and traditionally it had been focused on counterterrorism, counter-hijacking, hostage rescue, and that was a lot of tactical execution. It was brave people who are very skilled in their craft, typically, very good condition, courageous, that sort of thing. And that seemed to be the coin of the realm. You move into this environment, and suddenly two things have changed. One, it's no longer the question of going in the door and who shoots first and who does best. It's a question of knowing which door to go through. And so the most important thing for us became, how do we connect the dots? How do we pull these different dots together, which changed who was important in an organization, because to a little bit, the previous things we'd done become commoditized. They were the easier part of the task. And to connect the dots, suddenly you realized all the dots aren't inside our organization. So now we've got to link with other governmental organizations, intelligence community, the FBI, Department of State. All of them have got to be part of that team. So they got to feel like part of the team, they got to communicate like part of the team, and we got to have a shared mission or one mission. And that was a cultural change from the world in which I'd grown up.
Yeah. I mean, this book does such a great job of sort of giving examples and showing leadership in its greatest forms. I'd love to hear a couple experiences you both had of great leadership. Obviously, you can feel free to say good things about the general and vice versa, but just sort of a couple of those experiences.
Well, yeah, I'll start with some stuff we've seen in industry. So one of my favorite examples, an organization we've spent time with, is Brad Smith, who runs Intuit. So a great technology leader. He's been with that organization for many years, and we offer a case study on the work that he's done in one mission. And what Brad did was realized that he had purpose-built an organization that was in very distinct verticals around product lines, because that's what his customers wanted. They wanted TurboTax. They wanted Quicken. What suddenly he realized about 3 or 4 years ago, that's not what an interconnected customer base wants anymore. They want to go online, go to one stop, and get demands in a certain area met. And we all feel that. That's how we want to travel. That's how we want products to come to us in a very concise way. His organization was not structured like that. Most organizations aren't structured like that now. And so Brad looked at what General McChrystal had done inside of our task force and said, how can I apply that to my system? And over time, by creating a singular focus, this one mission idea, and going to his very senior business leaders that ran these verticals and said, look, we have a change in the environment. Our customers want us to be a unified whole. How do we do that? Do we all agree that that's what our customers need and deserve from us? And once they had buy-in around that single idea, then they could restructure the way they communicated and shared information across those boundaries. They no longer saw themselves as part of one single vertical P&L, instead as part of a whole company that was trying to service their customer in a different way.
Yeah.
What we found back in the fight with counterterrorism was they were all people who had something that they brought expertise. They were pilots, or they were operators that went in the door, or they were intel people, they did communications, and they had been raised and trained to stay in their lane, focus on what you do, be at your point in the assembly line and put that particular part on. And what we found was when we expanded it, had them all look at the entire process all the time, they still did their part, but suddenly we harnessed the brains of everybody. And you didn't stay in your lane. Suddenly you're doing your part, but you're going, wait a minute, We connect the dots. If you do that differently, this is going to work. It was a cultural shift, but you get more brains involved. People have a much higher level of buy-in or ownership to the process, and they start to measure success by the big picture, not by whether they do their particular part. As we used to say, it's not your batting average, it's whether the team gets into the World Series.
Yeah. Charlie, obviously Chris had a lot of great stories to share, and obviously he wasn't too specific about names and dates and that sort of thing, as I think that was a purposeful act. But do you have a favorite story that he shared about his time serving that really worked in the book?
Yeah, one that's actually really struck with people was a very mundane situation. It was him running around his base in Khost, Afghanistan. And what that vignette shows is kind of as Chris is moving through this compound and he's exploring the different factions of the organization and where their geographic locale is, he kind of realizes how the physical design of the facility reflects the broader cultural one of what JSOC was at the time. And one of the characters in that vignette was this pet monkey that Chris's SEAL platoon had. I later learned that
Chris, you had a pet monkey?
Yeah.
It gets slow sometimes.
Yeah. And so he was chasing it through the compound. And so we finished up the vignette, and I was like, this really strikes a lot with what organizations are seeing with co-location activity. And then Chris was like, yeah, you know what happened to that monkey a tour later? I was like, no. He goes, well, some guy just shot it. Yeah. And so I remember that. I mean, it was a fun vignette. That epilogue I didn't really need from Chris. Got it at the wrong time. Yeah,
just cut that out. Cut that part
yeah.
out. Exactly. Can you guys speak a little bit about what do you think drives people to the military, and what do you think inspires them to join the military? I think they look for a lot of the things that you can find in these books, a lot of those lessons of sort of leadership and self-talk and all those sort of things. What do you guys think?
Well, I can tell. I think it's changed since I joined, which wasn't that long ago, the late '90s. But I joined, like I said, a peacetime world, and so I wanted to be part of a team. I wanted to be in the SEALs. I wanted to challenge myself to make it through that selection. Those are, I guess, honorable reasons. But today's culture is much different. As I left active duty in 2012, but the young folks that we were seeing come into the service, they see what's going on in the world, and they knew they were joining a military that's is at conflict and will probably remain at conflict for the foreseeable future. And that's a different type of person. I mean, there's certainly a challenge aspect to it, but there's a deeper connection with a broad mission and the role of the country in the world than we felt even just 15, 20 years ago before the current state really took over.
Yeah. General?
Yeah, I joined in the 1970s, and I think many people, like I went almost because that's where the current in the river and my family took me. But I think most people were looking for something to challenge themselves and be a part of. I don't think it was the idea of serving the nation or a lofty cause. I think that grew inside us over time. You start because it looks interesting, it looks adventurous, it looks challenging, and then over time, it's almost bait and switch. They bring you in for that, and then you start to believe very deeply in the people that you serve, the people below you, and then the importance of the mission.
Yeah, I'll often say, because people, why did you want to join the SEAL teams? I say, well, do you want to know why I joined or why I stayed? Because those are two very different reasons. But that's the same in industry, or any profession you go into. Why did you go to medical school versus what do you like being a doctor? Right. Two very different answers, and the military is the same way. Yeah.
I mean, obviously you guys are retired, but the troop numbers are increasing, and obviously that's still a narrative that you're aware of. What do you guys think about the current leadership and the state of affairs now?
Well, I'll take this one. I'll keep you out of this. Yeah, I think we talk specifically for Afghanistan. The decision to increase troops in Afghanistan, a military one, could be based on a need for additional trainers, and I don't dispute that at all. I think Secretary Mattis is the right guy to make that, and I know he'll do a good job of it. But it's a policy decision. When you put more forces in, we are making a United States policy decision because we're pushing the time horizon out. We're going to be there longer. We're creating expectations in the Afghan people who we partnered with for 15 years. We're also creating impressions in the minds of the other people to include the enemy. I think the American people, led by our president, have to make that decision. We need to put it out in front of us and say, okay, is that what we want to do? Is that important enough to do it? Because what we don't want is 18 months from now or 2 years from now, and the people we sent, the additional forces, don't change the situation, and then we're at this position, well, what do we do now? Are we going to cut and run? Are we going to stay? I think we need to make that decision and then show the resolve over time. It's like people come to me and they say, we're going to have a baby. And I said, no, you're not. You're going to have a human being. It's going to last a lot longer than them being a baby. My son lives next door to me, and he's 33, so it lasts a long time.
I love that. Chris, this is your second book. Obviously, there's got to be other topics. People still have a hunger for this kind of information. I know, Jocko Willink and all these people have great podcasts that are inspirational, and Navy SEAL members. I mean, what's the next book?
Well, it's funny you should ask. We, General McChrystal and a few others are now starting the third book in what I think will be a three-part series. So there was Team of Teams, which established a broad theory of the case around how the information age affected us in the military and how others are probably experiencing that. So we had to change the system. One Mission's designed to be a roadmap of implementation. So leaders can dive into it and say, okay, I buy the theory, here's what we're gonna do to actually drive our organization like this. But there's a third component. We touch on it lightly in One Mission, but it deserves its own book, obviously, which is, if you do this, how do you have to change as a leader? Because it is a different model. If you were going to run a very inclusive, transparency, trust-based organization, that's a different structure. That's a different way of leading than a traditional top-down bureaucratic model. So the third book in the trilogy, which will be out in a little over a year, which will be written by General McChrystal and a few others, we'll finish out that series. So that's next for us.
And we've really got aspirations to make this a classic. And we're modeling it on Plutarch's Lives. And so the idea is to look at leadership with a capital L. Nowadays we talk about management or sort of tactical leadership. I think the nation and the world probably are ready for us to pull it back up again and say, all right, what does real leadership mean? Not succeeding in little things, but being something different. And I think studying some historical figures, some current figures, and then tying those together with a thesis will be a fun project.
Yeah. How have you found your experience going from a general to author? How's that experience been for you?
Yeah, author always sounds good when you start the project. And then about 2/3 of the way through, you go, no, it's fascinating because it allows you to delve in. And as Chris mentioned, in each book, what we've done is brought a young, recent Yale graduate on. And they come out with a fresh set of perspective, fresh eyes, and they challenge your thinking. The first author, or the first young man who partnered with me on my memoirs, is now a sergeant in 2nd Ranger Battalion. He's a team leader. At 31 years old, he's a Yale graduate, best-selling author, team leader in 2nd Ranger Battalion, and doing great. He just felt that need, and we've had that tradition.
Was this experience more difficult or less difficult than the memoirs? I have to imagine it's quite different.
Yeah, this Team of Teams was easier, and I think One Mission, we get better at it as we go.
I mean, is there any inspiration to do anything beyond the books? I mean, obviously you have some great talks for, TED Talk. I recommend people check it out. But these speaking engagements, how's it been, and how's the reaction been when you meet these people who maybe served, maybe haven't served, and how they're using these books?
Oh, it's great. I mean, there's a lot of interest in this sort of discussion right now. And I mean, the majority of our focus is on the work we do together in the McChrystal Group, our partnership. So we're helping companies go through this process, which is, there's an endless need for this in today's environment, because I cannot imagine that 15 to 20 years from now, organizations are run the same way they are now. So we're all in this together. The information age is having massive impacts on every space you look at, from political to healthcare to industry, military. So we're all wrestling with this together. How are we going to manage this amount of information flow? And this is our part of that conversation.
Yeah. Have there been any testimonials or any people who have come up to you and expressed how this book has changed their lives, or Team of Teams?
Well, it's fun with Team of Teams because the first thing that happened is we put Team of Teams out and people started reading it. I'd be stopped in airports and people would be holding the book and they go, "This is my company you were writing about. This is my organization. Please come help." Yeah. That happened. And then after people have been working with it and applying it, you start to say, okay, we've done this, this, this. And it's really rewarding to see that, because we didn't fix every problem. Yeah. One Mission fixes the problems we didn't get in the first one. Yeah. But it's extraordinary how well it resonates with people.
Yeah. And how is it to see, I mean, there's a ramp up of movies and television about the military. I mean, how is it like to express a different point of view, that those values? How's it like for you, Chris? And what do you think about some of this stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a real honor, actually. And I understand why. It's interesting to make a movie about, the gunfights and people kicking in doors and the action. We're all sort of drawn to that. And there are, countless heroes that have spent years in those environments. But there's also a different and very real aspect to what service members have gone through over the last 15 years, which is, take a 21-year-old Marine that's on the ground in some village in the middle of Afghanistan. That individual is dealing with a local population and elders, that they're dealing with civilian organizations. They're dealing with major funding lines. They're trying to collaborate with senior leaders around strategy. That's a complex problem solver. They maybe haven't been trained in an academic environment, but they are on the ground figuring out multidimensional problems. And that's the type of veteran now we're getting back into the workforce. So it's really a unique position for us to be able to try to highlight that for industry and say, look, here's the veteran generation coming back. And in my opinion, that's one of the most important things that this generation of veterans will offer back to industry.
Absolutely. Well, I think we have some questions in the audience. So we're going to start right there.
Thank you for being here, and also thanks for your service. I had a quick question for you regarding this idea of culture change. Culture change can be really, really hard. As much as people from up top want to push culture change down and people on the bottom want to embrace that culture change, it can sometimes get lost in an organization, especially in organizations where people potentially could become irrelevant with that culture change. So how do you think about kind of the idea of culture change and pushing it down when, in fact, some of the ideas of culture change can actually threaten people who are supposed to be embracing it and pushing it down?
I'd offer one quick thought on that, which was, we say this, any organization we're starting to have a conversation with is, this was, for us, this was a culture change masked inside of a process shift. So we knew the processes weren't working. I could feel that on the ground as our senior leaders started to change the way we communicated, the speed with which we resynchronized, the amount of decentralization they were becoming comfortable with. That's all process. You can map that out and figure it out. What we navigated toward, starting at the senior level, was a change in culture. If we're going to move faster with more inclusion, more transparency, our leaders started to use different language. They started to invite people into conversation in a way that hadn't happened before. So I agree with you. If you start with just saying we're going to change our culture, well, to what end? And why are we doing it? If you can map it to the external problems, in our case, we need to move faster. We need the teams on the ground to be able to go from A to B without checking in with the big system. And we're also going to evolve as a culture as a result of that. Then it gets everyone on a much more common page. But defining that problem and why you're changing is the critical first step.
What's your name, sir?
My name's Ryan.
It's a very good question you raised. Basically, how do you bypass what in network science are called bottlenecks? So people who actively refuse to transmit information, or the context of a culture change from one part of the organization to another, possibly for self-centered reasons. One of the processes we talk about in One Mission, and this is a practical book, is how you create multimedia forms and digital communication tools that allow for kind of live interactions between the very strategic leadership of an organization. So somebody as kind of charismatic and commanding as General McChrystal, who would be leading that culture change, and how you can get them to interact with the very junior levels of the organization. So in the task force, what happened is you'd often have a two-star general talking to somebody who was a 19-year-old enlisted guy in the Rangers. And what you do then is, by broadcasting the nuances of why that culture is changing, why the organization is changing the way it operates, and the interactions that have to happen between different teams in it, you lose what we call in the book kind of the telephone tree effect of passing on a message and risking that message being lost at different rungs of the organization. So you eliminate the opportunity for those people who are self-centered and hoarding information and stopping culture change from doing that effectively. I recommend you read the book. It's a good question.
Well played, well played. Okay, next question, guys, right there.
This question is for General McChrystal as well as for Chris. How would both of you see the war on terror as progressing as of today, based on what's been going on in Europe and recently in the Philippines? I don't feel terribly optimistic, but that's just a layperson's view.
No, I certainly respect your view on that, because I probably view it somewhat the same. If you think about the war on terror or terrorism or terrorists, I wouldn't focus on a single organization. I wouldn't say that ISIS is the beginning and the end of the problem. Terrorism is used as a tactic for different groups to get something done. It's originally designed to frighten us and also to inconvenience us. And the more they do both, the more you're willing to negotiate, compromise on things that they might want. When their goals are so big as something like Al-Qaeda first said, which is as the West out of the region. That's not going to happen, but it is a good coalescing idea. And that gets to the real key here. People join terrorist groups for a variety of reasons. One is because they like to be a part of something. Some of the same reasons people joined Al-Qaeda were the same reasons they joined the SEALs or elite forces. They want to be a part of something. But the other is the idea. And really the thing that worries me most about what we see in terrorism today is the ability to franchise an idea. We're living in a digital age. We're on the ground in a digital manifestation of that. And the ability to transmit that idea in a franchise way. ISIS doesn't send any money to groups in Africa. It doesn't send leadership. It doesn't provide guidance. And yet those organizations accept the cloak or the name. And so ISIS, with no investment, gets the value of it. And they are able to leverage frustrations that are different around the world. A young person in Paris that might have been radicalized might be for completely different reasons than someone in Morocco or someone in Nigeria or someone in San Diego. But when you find frustrations, you can leverage them, and when you put a cause around it, it feels better. So what we need to do is think of this as an idea problem. Ideas spring from conditions, and so it's not sexy. It's not bearded guys with fancy weapons kicking open doors that's going to end terrorism. It's going to be ending some of the things that cause people to be so unhappy. Some of the economic inequity, the lack of opportunities, education. Those are the real drivers to fix it. And you got to do some things in the near term. You got to drop some bombs. You got to do some military activities. But that's never the solution, in my view. The solution always is far upstream. And it's more expensive, and sometimes it feels more frustrating, but it's the only thing I think that sticks. Thank you.
Inspired answer. Well, this is why I need to pick up this book, guys. Okay, we have one more time. We have one more question right here.
Hi, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service. General McChrystal, this question is for you. As an American citizen, and I've been watching what feels like a discombobulated foreign policy play out, I'm legitimately scared. I'm scared of what I'm seeing and what I'm watching, what I'm hearing, what I'm reading. Would you be able to comment on our country's current situation with that?
Yeah, if you are scared, if you are hungry, if you can't sleep at night, buy this book. Buy
Drop
2
the mic.
copies. But really, I think if you look at the world right now, it is frightening because things are changing so fast, and things which weren't threats before are threats now because technology has suddenly allowed individuals and small groups to do things that they couldn't do before. Weapons of mass destruction, cyber attacks, and whatnot. So we've changed the balance. What used to be only the purview of nation states is now the purview of smaller nation states like North Korea, but also these groups. So it makes it feel very, very frightening. Actually, though, statistically, the number of people killed in conflicts around the world is continuing to drop. The number of people in poverty is continuing to drop. There are a number of trends that actually are remarkably reinforcing, but the anecdotal nature of the way we see news and all often makes it feel much worse. Now, I have worries about the political process right now because we're going through a period when people are pushing ideas, and they're pushing them so strongly, and they tend to be very extreme left or right or up or down. And I don't think the political discourse in the middle has got any traction right now. We're going to have to get to that, not just inside the United States, but around the world. But the big pieces are actually room for more optimism than they are for fear. At the same time, I admit when I get on the news, I have the same kind of concerns. So I circle back, get the book, problem solved.
I like it. Well, the book is one mission, guys. Order it right now, and thank you so much for being here, gentlemen. Really appreciate the time. Another round of applause, guys.
Thank you.